Hi, in this video we're going to talk about action filters and how they relate to web pages in C#. So what is an action filter? So a filter is some kind of an event that happens before, during, or after the execution of something you've already programmed. So for instance, in our example, we're going to implement something with a login form. So let's say we have the current process here where we have a login request, we have a controller that does the process on the login, and then finally we display some kind of a results. So what we'd like to do is we're going to insert another item here. This is the action filter. And so in our case, we're going to check to see if the user is authenticated or not, or do they have the right access level to get to this page or not. And so the action filter comes in between here in this section. Now there are many different layers of processing that go through a request. Every time that you click something on a web page, there's this whole stack of things that occurs. And we've seen a lot of these already. So for instance, let's take exception filters, for example. So as you're running your code, you can see sometimes that there's an error. Well, the exception errors are going through some kind of a filter. And so what we're doing here is just looking at one of the many things that happen during the processing of one of your click events or one of your controller events. So C# and ASP.NET allow us to do some customization here in this area called action filters. So there are several action filters that are built into what we can do in C#. So first of all, there's something called an output cache that allows us to contain information that doesn't have to be regenerated every time there's a request. And so caching improves web performance. There's also errors. So if you want to customize how an error is handled so that the user doesn't see the ugly exception page, you can make your own. And also authorization. So this is probably the most common thing that you would want to do, is to make sure that a page is not viewable by the general public if you have some sensitive information on it. So let's talk about the authorized filter first of all. So authorized is obviously something to check to see if you are, well, authorized. So you can check to see if this person should view page X or not. And if not, then we reject it and say go back to the login page and try again. Another item is called the results filter. So a results filter will be executed after the person has requested the page. The page has been generated, and before it arrives to the user, we do something to it. So whether we put it in the memory cache or we put some kind of a stamp on it, we have a different version of the page that gets to the user because of the filter. Also exceptions. So if you think of an error that occurs on the page, you might want to either log those errors or you might want to modify what the page looks like. And so that way the user gets their customized version of an error page. So we can update things when errors occur. Also there's custom filters, and that's what we're going to be building in the next few minutes with our code. A customization is to, well, make your own filter. So in our case, we are going to create a custom authorization filter. Now I showed you just a minute ago that there were actual authorization filters. Why are we building a custom filter to make authorization? Well, that's because we have our own authorization system on the application that we're demonstrating. So what you can do then is you can say, I'm going to authorize you to either see this page or not, or else you can make your own modifications. So coming up right now, we're going to do some coding and we're going to make a custom authorization filter. So what I have on the screen now is an application that we've developed in previous tutorials. So this is a login page, and we can choose a username and password. And if somebody logs in correctly, we'll get a success page. And if they log in incorrectly, they'll get a rejection page. And so this is where we're starting from. So I'm going to open up the controller for the logins, and you can see that we have an event here called process login. And then we can either show a success or show a failure. And so that's where we're starting. So now I'm going to invent an action that requires a login before you see it. And so right now there's no protection on it, so the login will be open to everybody. Let's say I'm going to call this thing private section must be logged in. That's a pretty obvious name of what it's supposed to represent. So there's really nothing too secure about this, but I'm just going to return a string. So I'll return something called content, and then the string that says I'm a protected method if the proper attribute is applied to me. And so let's see what this looks like when we run it. So the application's up and running. And as before, if we type in login for the controller name, we get the index method, which is to show the view called login. Now what I want to do is to show this next thing. So I'm just going to copy the method name and then switch back to my browser, and after login I put the slash and then the next section, which is private section must be logged in. And so if we press enter, we should see the string here. Now we have not logged in and we got the string, so obviously our security system and our action filter has not been applied, which is what we're going to do next. Now let's return to the controller and add a couple of more attributes to this action here. So first of all, I'm going to say that this is a GET request. And then the next item down, we're going to call this thing custom authorization. And so this doesn't exist, so we're going to have the option to choose one of the fixes. And so what I want to do is generate a new class in a separate file called custom authorization. And then you'll see it appear in the folder where the controllers are. And then open up that and you will see some code. So now in this new class, I'm going to add a new interface to this class that we're going to implement. It's called Authorization Filter, spelled exactly like this. And you will see that we have the angry underline that says we don't understand what this is. And so we are going to use the MVC filters library. Now the red line still doesn't disappear because for a different reason. So now it says the class does not implement the interface that you specified. So we'll choose suggestions and we will implement the interface. So the parameter that is passed into here is called a context. So what we're going to use then is redirection. So context.result is going to be a redirect result. So we're going to send this to some other page if we're not authorized. So what page do we want to put inside of these quotation marks? Well, if they're not authorized, let's send them back to /login, which is the login screen, and then they can try again. So let's run the application and see what this authorization filter does. So the application is up and running again. I'm going to put /login, and then I'm going to go all the way down to where it says private section must be logged in. And you can see that I cannot get there. So if I was redirected, it comes back to the login page, which is the login form. So right now, nobody can see that page, even if you are logged in, because I haven't set up any logic other than the fact that we reject everybody. So the filter is being used. Now we need to customize the filter so that it will actually be used correctly. So just a minute ago, I said we were going to build this custom authorization filter, and some of you may have thought immediately, why are we doing custom authorization when there's already an option built in for ASP.NET? So when we created our application some time ago, we chose to have no authentication. The usual way when you're creating an account is to select one of the options you see on the screen here. So this is right at the setup when you build a new application. You select authorization and some kind of an account. So individual user accounts works very well. It creates a database of users, automatically authenticates them. And so what we're doing here is a little bit of extra work. We are going to be building session variables and doing our own authorization. So the reason why we're doing it this way instead of the recommended Microsoft way is because in an educational setting, I want to make sure that you understand how to build SQL statements, how the users table is built, and once you figure that out, then maybe it's better to go with the authorization systems that they've already built in here. So the technology that is in use here is called an ORM, or an object relational mapper, and it creates databases for you automatically through something called migrations. So if you want to see migrations, I have another tutorial called the Crash Course on ASP.NET, and you can build an entire app using all of the shortcuts that Microsoft provides. So, but the current tutorial is showing you a little bit more slowly and a manual way of building user tables. So next we need to go and do some configuration on session variables. So cookies and session variables are closely related concepts. If you haven't heard about those or know much about them, let's do a little bit of background. So cookies are client-side files that are stored in the browser, and they contain user information. Session variables are similar. They're just pieces of data that are stored on the server, one for each browser session. And so it contains user information such as, are you logged in or are you not? A cookie is not dependent on a session, but a session is dependent on a cookie. So that's kind of a distinction there. So a session has a unique cookie placed on the browser that matches up with the unique number that probably should not be shared. Also, cookies expire whenever the cookie author decides to make them expire. So they can sit around for years. However, a session variable is expired whenever the browser closes. So session variables work very well for whether you're authenticated or not. A cookie is limited in size, and then a session is unlimited, really, in size of how much server space you want to use. So there are other things about removing cookies and sessions. So there is a function called cookie.remove, and sessions you have to ask for something called a session key name that can be removed. Now in the code that we're about to write, we're going to actually configure session variables. And so I've brought up here the appropriate web page for the documentation on Microsoft and how sessions are used. So a background here on session and state management in ASP.NET. So you can see that there are some session state items. What I'm interested in is down here in some configuration. So this particular file, we're going to modify. It is the startup class. We're going to add the things that are in yellow. So this item here, and then there's another item down here that says use sessions. So with these configurations, we're going to be able to save sessions for our user clients. So we'll come back to this screen in just a minute. So now we're going to go into a file called startup.cs. And this here is where you configure things such as, do you want to use sessions or not? So the section that we're looking for is in here called configure services. So right here is where we're going to add some new code. So coming back into Microsoft's documentation, I'm going to copy these lines here and put them into my configure services area. So I'm swiping back into my code here, and I'm going to paste in this section here. So these are going to include session variables. One more statement that I have to include. So down at the bottom here where it says app user session, this is in the action called configure. So we'll copy this one line and see if we can find configure. And down here in the area where we've got all these using ideas, we're going to go ahead and paste in use session. So this has allowed us now to start sessions, to add variables to the session, and to check to see if the session is set. Many of the students in my class have taken PHP classes, and in PHP it is a simple message of session start, and then you can begin using session variables. There's some configuration here in ASP.NET that requires session start to actually work. So that's what we've just done. Now I want to be able to track who's logged in. So let's go into the login controller and we'll find the section where the login is successful. So I go to the if statement to see if there is a valid user. Now we've done some logging here, but just inserting next to it is this command. We're going to say in the HTTP context .session, we are going to set a string value. And the string value is anything that you would like it to be. So I'm going to call this string value as username and assign it exactly what username was successfully logged in. You can see that we have to do some importing to make set string work properly. Now let's do something similar in the login failure section. So if the user is not logged in, let's remove the session variable. So it's HTTP context.session, remove is the command, and then the string name is username. So they have to be spelled exactly the same as what I did earlier. Okay, so now we're going to go into the action filter that we created a few minutes ago. We're going to first of all see if we can get that username out of the session. So assuming that the person logged in, we will have a session variable called username. So let's set a string up to call it username, and we'll use context.http context.session.getString and then username. And of course it looks like we have an import. Now we want to check to see if the username actually was captured or it was retrieved. If it is set to null, that means there was nothing in the username area and we should redirect the person back to the login screen. In other words, it's a login has not yet occurred. Otherwise, we'll do the else statement and we'll say, let's do nothing. Let's let the filter just pass the request through because obviously the user is logged in. And so now we have a way to filter out people that are authorized to view the page from people that are not authorized. So let's see if the authorization filter actually works. I'm going to run the application. So the app is up and running. Let's go ahead and put in the login and try this long section called private section must be logged in. And you can see that it redirects me back to the login page because the session variable has not been set yet. Now, if we want to set the username, we're going to try and log in. So Max and his password, we will log in and hopefully set that variable. So now that I'm logged in, I'm going to try to go to that authorization page. So let's see, if I delete the process login and I have the long section called private section must be logged in, and it redirected me back to the login page. So something's not working. I was expecting to see the authorized page. So let's go see why that might not work. I'm going to close here and stop my application. And let's go back into the startup folder here, or the startup file. So what I put in here on line 58 was called use session. But I noticed something else that's already in here. It might not be in yours, but it is in mine. It says here, use authorization. So remember I mentioned that authorization is something we're customizing in our version of the application. So I'm going to remove that, and then I'm going to use the sessions now as my authorization system. So let's save this and try it again. So the page is up and running again. Let's try an attempt at that page first. So let's go to the secure section. Must be authorized to see it, and you can see that it rejected me and put me back to the login form. So now let's use a valid login. We'll choose Max and attempt to log in. We have a login success. So now let's try it again. I'm going to put in the private section, and this time it says you can see the page. So the session variable is obviously a difference here that lets you see the page if you've been logged in and not see the page if you've not been logged in. Okay, so now I'm going to go and do some more research in the debugger. So let's go take a look here at line 12 of our custom filter. So this is the line where it says username is going to be fetched from the session. So we're going to see that it's either null or it has a value. Let's go ahead and run the application. All right, the app is up and running. Let's try to get to the authorized page first, or the restricted page. And we should stop here at the authorization filter class. So we can see that this code is being called whenever we try to get to this class. And let's skip over one step and let's see what's inside of username. So you can see that username is set to null. So it tried to fetch something called username from the session and there was nothing there. So when we continue, we should get sent back to the login screen. Okay, this time I'm going to log in. So we're going to use Max and his password and we get hopefully a success. There it is, the success page. So now let's attempt to go back to that restricted page. And let's get to this point again. And so now when I go check on the username, you can see that username has been set to Max. So attempt to try this a couple times, maybe if it doesn't work the first time. But we do have a session variable set for Max. And now when I try to continue, I should get a result that says I'm a protected method if the proper attribute is applied to me. So run this and make sure that you can verify that the user session has been set up. So let's look for another example where we can use an action filter. So in this case here, we have set up a logger in our controller. We're going to use a filter now to do the logging for us, which will clear up a lot of the code that we see here. So the first thing I'm going to do is comment out all of the lines where we're doing logging right now. So we could delete these, or I'm just going to comment them out so that we can see that they used to be there. So instead of all that code, I'm going to create an action filter. So in square brackets above the class name or the action name, I'm going to say log action filter. And then I'm going to create a new file, a new class that will implement that. So now let's open up the new file that we just created, and let's take a look at the top here. We're going to implement something new. So I'm going to add the interface called iActionFilter to this class name. And you can see that I have to do an import to make that occur. And then the red underline is still there, so I'm going to choose the option for implementing methods. So we have two methods here that says onActionImplemented or executed, and then the other one is onActionExecuting. So now inside of the code for the onActionExecuted, I'm going to call my logger.getInstance, and then we're going to put out an info log. So let's import the actions or import the class from the other folder. Then inside the quotation marks, let's put in a message that says what's happening. So at this event, we will be leaving the process login method. So for the other action, it will be also with the process login method, but this time this will trigger when we enter it. So I'll say entering the process login method. Now the next goal is to log out whatever username and password was submitted. And so this is a little bit more difficult here inside the filter. So I'm going to first of all tell it that I'm expecting to get a user object. So that is from the user models. And let's import or use the folder for the models. Now I'm going to get this from the variable called context. So context has, lots of information about what's happening at this very moment. And the context.controller is what I'm after. So you can see that it's going to get the controller. So this will get the login controller. Now I have to put a cast on this so that way it actually says, hey, this is a controller object. Now, a nice thing about the controller is there's a property called viewData. So if I put a dot viewData after here, I can also get whatever model has been passed along. And then finally you can see that it says, hey, you've got a model and you're assigning it to a user object. You're missing an explicit cast. So then I will cast this as well. So there's two casts in this statement, but what the end result is that I will be able to get the user that was passed along through the request. So now I can use my logger if I want to print out whatever user was attempted on the login. So I will say user that logged in, and then I will put the toString method on the end of the user class. Now it really doesn't matter. I could put this log at the beginning in the entering or at the exiting phase here. I'm just going to leave this one as the entering. Let's log in and see if the log actually works. So I've got the application up and running and the login page is here. So let's go ahead and choose login, and we have a login success. Now let's go see if the filtering is working as it was in a previous tutorial. So I'm going into the folders to explore the objects that I'm looking at here in my project. I'm going into the bin folder and the debug folder and the net5, and finally we get to the logs folder. And there is a text file here. So let's open this with Notepad, and you can see that the message shows that there was an entering and a leaving, and then also there was this message that says of the person that was logged in. So this complicated casting exercise appears to work. I was able to get the user object and print it off to the screen. So what's the advantage of using an action filter? Well, the idea is that we have all these log statements in here that are no longer necessary. So I could literally go and clean up a lot of my code. And since that really isn't central to the logic of my program, it's better not to have it here. So with one statement that is really outside of the action method, I can do all of the work that is done inside there. So an action filter really does clean up the controller code, and it puts it all in its own file. We've implemented an action filter to do authentication as well as logging. So to think of when you would use an action filter, you would look for opportunities where you are performing actions immediately before a controller action, during an action, or right afterwards to handle errors, authentication, or logging, or other things that would happen kind of on the side of the main logic of your program. So thanks for sticking with me. Now you know something about action filters in C#.